It's Sunday afternoon, the 29th of August, 2021, and I'm standing here at the Palmer House in Cataloochee, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, on a gravel part of the road that comes down through the valley. And this is the house that was originally settled by George and Polly Palmer, who were directed into the valley by Mr. Howell over on Jonathan Creek, about 1839 or 1840, and came in and raised their family. The Palmer family, very prominent here in the valley and in Haywood County to this day. But they built here, actually not in this actual location. They built a little further up between here and the barn that you see off in the distance. That was the original location of the first Palmer house. But then they very shortly thereafter built here. And the first section of the house is the one in the further distance there. And there's a stone chimney, if you can see through the leaves. That stone chimney, original fireplace from the original part of the home. And then they built a second log cabin there. There's a hallway between them now. Back in the day, they were two different buildings, and that was a dog trot that ran between them. They did the cooking in the one on your left, and then they lived in the one on the right. And then even later than that, another section was added on because somewhere about the early 1940s, Mark Hanna lived here with his family. Mark and his wife and children lived in this place. This was the ranger station up here in Cataloochee, and Mark Hanna lived here with his family. And so, much later, the two cabin structures were enclosed by this nice milled lumber, made into one nice house, and it still is here. Now, another thing to note about this structure is that I'm standing at the front of the house. When you drive up on the Park Road that was constructed by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the late 1930s, you're actually coming up to the back of the house. This is the front. That's why that cement sidewalk is right there. And so the road is here in front of me. The road bed is right there. It runs between that spring house on the left and the log blacksmith shop there in the distance on the right. That's the original road bed, and thus this is the front of the house. Now that's also the case with Palmer Chapel Church up there. When you park and walk up to it on the current road, you're walking up to the back of the building. The original road ran in front of the church, between the front of it and the creek. The road ran along there parallel with Cataloochee Creek. So just a little something about that. Now, as I say, George and Polly Palmer raised their family here, a very prominent family in this part of the country. And George lived until, I think it was 1859. He died on his birthday, working on the road that comes in here. So when you drive up Cove Creek Road and you come through the Bennett turn and through Cove Creek Gap and make your way down here, if you think the road is rough and windy now, you should have seen what it was like when the people first came in here. And they worked hard on that road. As Papaw Jarvis Caldwell used to say, they would dig it and chop it to get enough width so that they could pull a wagon through there. And of course, there were a lot of stones and rocks that they ran into, and they had no blasting material. There was no dynamite then, no nitroglycerin. That was well before that era. And not even black powder for them. They didn't have enough of it. So what they had to do was to heat the rocks up. They would build a fire underneath them and heat them excessively. And then they would get tubs full of cold water and pour on them. So the combination of that heat and cold water would break up the rocks so that they could dig roads. Interesting side note here, when I was in Papua New Guinea back in 2008, and we were walking up an old road from the Rai coast where we had landed to the village of Umbaldi, I was talking to one of the men there, and I said, "How did y'all dig these roads in here?" And he said, much effort. He said, "We had to dig them." He said, "Where they were rocks, we had to build fires under them." And I said, "Oh, you heated the rocks up and then pour cold water on them?" And he said, "How did you know that?" I said, "I know things. I'm a preacher. I get paid to know things." So just way stories can be the same or similar all the world over. But that's how the road was gotten in here. And George Palmer died, as I say, on his birthday in 1859, as I recall, getting it here. Now, this house was the first stopover place for people in the latter half of the 1800s when they would come into the valley after that road had largely been completed or looked much like it does today. They would come in, cross the creek down here where that upper iron bridge is, and would stop off here. And there were a couple of lawyers. I've got some notes because can't keep up with everything. Wilbur Ziegler and Ben Grosscup, if I'm saying it correctly. They wrote the book that was entitled The Heart of the Alleghenies, or Western North Carolina. They came in June of 1879, stayed here, and before they went to bed that evening, even before they ate supper, they caught 40 trout standing in one place out here in this Sycamore Pond, as it's called, where Mark Hanna used to say the water is only about shoe mouth deep. Standing in one place, they caught about 40 trout. The next day, the party got out there and fished, and they say in their book that the party caught between 400 and 500 trout, those good old mountain speckled trout. Amazing. One of the Palmer boys had caught 100 himself. Don't know which one of them it was. So if you come up here and fish and have a hard time and you're wondering why they're not more plentiful than they are, it's because people like that used to catch them so fiercely back in the day. I remember well, Paul Woody, when I was visiting with him. Paul was raised up over in Little Cataloochee on Woody Creek in the 1920s. He was a World War II veteran, and a fine man indeed. Paul Woody told me that in the 1920s, when his mother was taking care of them, raising them, if she got busy during the day and couldn't get supper together, all she had to do was take her dishpan, go out there to that Woody Creek and just dip it in the water, and she could pull out enough trout that way to feed them. She could get a whole mess that way. Man, I'd love to have a good mess of speckled trout right now. Those things are good to eat. Other things to note about this location is that near here, somewhere in this location, a man by the name of Zach Clark killed a deputy sheriff named Rayburn about 1838, again according to Mark Hanna. It's often said that the first law enforcement person killed in the line of duty was Sheriff Noland here in the county in the early part of the Civil War, but according to Mark Hanna, a deputy sheriff named Rayburn was killed in 1838 by a man named Zach Clark, who hid out in the woods back up in here above this house, up on this ridge, a half a mile or more up that way, in a sort of a flat area. There's a rock outcropping up there, a nice shelter area. I've been up there, and people would bring him food, and in particular, a man named Nettie McFalls would carry provisions to him. They said Nettie McFalls killed the biggest buck anybody had ever seen in this country down at the ford of the Cataloochee, or the place that is the lower Iron Bridge that we refer to it. And also Zach Clark's brother, interestingly enough, Dick Clark, would bring food to him. He lived up here on this ridge, and then also he hid out some on Shanty Branch, and had to for a long time, for at least a few years, as law enforcement was after him. But that's just a little something to note here. Again, at the Palmer place here in Cataloochee, every location that you see here, whether there's an existing building or whether a building or something else was there, there are stories all up and down this valley and on these ridges. There is so much history here, and I'm just doing my best to tell you what I've been told or what I've researched so that these things won't be forgotten. And again, I'm not arguing. If you've heard these stories in a different way, maybe your family knows more about these events that I'm conveying here, I'm not arguing with you. I wouldn't presume to do that. I wasn't there, didn't see these things happen. Just telling you what I was told, or as I remember being told, and as I've read. And so, as I've told people many times, I know a lot of stories. Some of them are true. But here at the Palmer House in Cataloochee, may God bless you.